Right. So let me just talk you through the notes that you've got here. So you have to know for the syllabus, you have to know two cycles. One is of carbon, the element, and the other one is of nitrogen, the element. Um, the reason that you have to know these is because if you think about it, none of this stuff is new. So the carbon that's in the world today has always been in the world. It just gets cycled and cycled. And the same thing for the nitrogen. So you have to know how the carbon is used and then how it's replaced in the ecosystem of the earth, basically, and how, yeah, what happens to it and how it changes as it goes around the cycle. So the first thing is that the cycle has to be balanced. So if it's not balanced, then you're going to have things like global warming and too much CO2 in the air and all that kind of stuff. So having it balanced is what's most important, right? So the reason that we have carbon is it's a major component in carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So those are the molecules that make you, right? You eat your carbs, you eat your fats, you eat your proteins, and then it makes you, right? It makes your body, it makes your blood, it makes everything. So we need the carbon. And the cycle is about how do you get it as a human, and then how do you replace it into the ecosystem as a human as well, right? So it involves the exchange between living organisms and their atmosphere, right? So it's basically that's just saying it involves things that are living and then just the atmosphere in general, the air, the grass, whatever, right? The earth itself, that kind of stuff. Okay. So in the carbon cycle, carbon is constantly removed from and then returned to the environment, right? So we remove it by eating it in the form of carbs, and then it gets replaced. For example, every time you breathe out, you're breathing out carbon dioxide, right? What does carbon dioxide have? It has the carbon. So then that's replacing it in the atmosphere, right? So the processes involved in the carbon cycle, you have to know each of these and you have to be able to explain them as well. So the first one is photosynthesis. So hopefully you've done photosynthesis already. And all you need to know is that plants photosynthesize. That is how they get their food. And how do they do that? They take in CO2 from the air. So they take the carbon from that CO2 and they put it into sugars, which are carbohydrates, which also contain the carbon, right? So that's step one. We've taken the carbon from the CO2 in the air and the plants have made sugars with that carbon, okay? Once the plants have done that, now we can eat the plants, or the cow can eat the plants, and then we eat the cow, right? And that's the process of feeding. That's how carbon moves through living organisms. Something will eat the plant, something will eat that thing that ate the plant, right? So just think us and a cow. The grass makes the carbon dioxide into sugar. The cow eats the grass, we eat the cow. Now we have the carbon that was initially the CO2, right? Can you see how that flows in the chain? Okay. Once we have eaten the food, we then respire and we release CO2. And then that CO2 will go back to the trees, right? And you've got this idea of a cycle, right? And it's continual. It does not ever stop, right? Fossilization is the process of decomposition, basically. So things die and then they decay really, really, really slowly. And as they do that, we get fossil fuels, which we then will use as your petrol, your diesel, whatever fuel you can possibly think of, right? The last process that releases carbon into the atmosphere is combustion. Now, this is technically unnatural because humans have started to burn the fuels and stuff, and we are then also releasing the CO2 into the air. Okay, so if you look at this picture, this is now in word form, right? So can you see here we've got carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? If we start here at the top, that will go into the plant and it's used in photosynthesis to produce carbohydrates and lots of other molecules, right? The animal will then eat those carbohydrates and the carbon in it can now do two things, right? It can be released back into the atmosphere, right? Because it's respiring, so that CO2 is now being released. So you've got this little mini cycle there, okay? If you look at the bottom here, what is happening is that the carbon is also being broken down when these living things die, right? So now you've got carbon stored in fossil fuels. These get burnt and then these get burnt and then the carbon is now released back into the atmosphere and then you've got this whole big cycle, right? So normally your questions will have maybe, hi Sophie. Normally your questions will have this picture and some labels, and they'll say things like, what process releases carbon dioxide? So you could say respiration or burning of fossil fuels, right? So the release is the arrows going up. And then maybe what processes take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Then you'll have things like photosynthesis. Okay, so if you follow those arrows, you can go a couple of ways around, but start with the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over here, and then you'll go photosynthesis, eaten by animals, carbon dioxide released, or photosynthesis, fossilization of the plants, or fossilization of the animals makes fossil fuels, which are then burnt, which then release CO2 into the atmosphere. Okay, I will do another video on the nitrogen cycle for you in a second.